Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to IGE Forum. Today, I'm so very excited to have a distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Stephen Roach, who doesn't really need much introduction. I could not think of any better expert with the insightful policy perspectives on the impending multiple crises that we face, especially in the area of geopolitics involving the United States and China. In fact, Dr. Roach, today's speaker, has just published a new book entitled Accidental Conflicts: America, China, and the Clash of Force Narrative. He will be joining us live to discuss the recent and prospective developments on the US-China relations based on his latest book. And also we'll discuss the global economic outlook later on. Perhaps the latest incident with the Chinese balloon over the United States may make today's forum even more timely. Dr. Roach is currently senior fellow, excuse me, at Yale Law School's Tsai China Center, after serving as senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs for 13 years, and senior lecturer at Yale's School of Management. Before coming to Yale, Stephen was chairman of Mogonstanley Asia and the firm's chief economist for most of his 30-year career at Morgan Stanley. He is also widely known as author of best-selling books and numerous articles. Today's format is as follows. To be in line with our tradition for this sort of webinar series, starting with Dr. Roach's opening speech for about 20 minutes or so, we plan to carry on our conversation with the Q&As for the rest of our time. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Stephen Roach for his opening speech. Stephen, it's great to see you again today, and thank you very much for joining us live at this late hour in your time. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. June. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today and talk to you about my views on the increasingly ominous and very serious conflict between the United States and China. In the past 5 years, we've gone from a trade war to a tech war, and now, as the balloon incident demonstrates very clearly, into a phase of conflict that is very reminiscent of a Cold War. The book that I have just published a couple of months ago, Accidental Conflict, produces a framework to think about the relationship between the United States and China from an economic point of view, a political point of view, as well as a social point of view. And it's not just a statement of a problem, but it offers and concludes with a proposed solution to the problem. And the book itself is broken down into 4 distinct parts. The first part is really a history of the modern relationship between these two nations, which I will summarize in just a moment. The bulk of the book, parts 2 and parts 3, develop a detailed assessment of the false narratives that both nations have with respect to the other. My thesis is that the trajectory of conflict, increasingly serious, would not have occurred had it not been for these false narratives. And then in the final part of the book, which I will spend a disproportionate part of my time with you on today, I bring these narratives together on both sides of the relationship, explain the dynamic that is so worrisome, and then offer my plan to resolve the conflict. So the first part focuses on the relationship itself. And I stress, as you can see in the timeline on the right-hand side of the slide, that the relationship is a moving target. It started off very innocently as what I call a marriage of convenience between two needy nations, two needing economies who needed new growth solutions, and they each offered the other some very, very important sources of economic growth. America offered China a huge market for its exports, and China offered America low-cost goods that consumers needed, who were under pressure to make ends meet. China also offered the United States open-ended demand to purchase the treasuries that we needed to sell overseas to fund our large budget deficits. And gradually over time, China also offered the United States its third largest and most rapidly growing export market. This mutual attraction deepened and became a strong interdependency, or what I call a codependency. But in recent years, especially the last 5 years, the codependency has become a real source of conflict. And the conflict itself gives rise to the false narratives, which I will take you to in just a second. But it behooves us to try to understand why two codependent nations resort to false narratives. I argue in the book that both nations are constrained by their domestic politics. And it's that politically expedient motive that gives rise to false narratives. Both nations are surprisingly vulnerable and unwilling to admit that to their political constituencies. So as a cover for the vulnerability, they end up blaming their partners for problems of their own making. All of the false narratives that I describe in the book, they're not big lies. They are fact-based narratives, but they distort the problems that have arisen between the two nations as they've moved from a trade war to a tech war, now to a Cold War. This is a list on the left of some of the false narratives that I talk about in the book, and I want to just highlight two of them illustrated on the right-hand side of this slide. My favorite false narrative of the United States with respect to China is that we blame China for our trade deficit. We have a record trade deficit that puts enormous pressure on workers and companies and the communities in which they are employed. China is the largest piece of our trade deficit. The numbers for 2022 just actually came in today, the final numbers, and China accounted for 32% of our record multilateral trade deficit, a smaller piece than it had, but by far the biggest piece. The point of the slide on the right, which again was just updated with new data available today, is that while China is the largest, it's one of 106 bilateral deficits. We have a multilateral trade problem because we don't save. And when you lack saving and want to grow, you run a balance of payments deficit, and to attract the foreign capital, you experience the multilateral trade deficits with many, many countries. You cannot fix a multilateral trade deficit, excuse me, by putting pressure on one trading partner, no matter how big a source it is of the trade deficit. So the false narrative is we blame China for a trade deficit that is an outgrowth of our own shortfall of domestic saving. China's guilty of the same tendency, and the false narrative that I choose to illustrate in the right-hand, the bottom right-hand slide of this chart just shows you China's failed structural rebalancing, where the consumption share never got to 40% and has been falling in the last couple of years, far short of what China aspires to with respect to the rebalancing of its growth model from exports and investment to consumer-led growth. China blames that failed rebalancing incorrectly, on my view, on America's policies to contain its rise. While America certainly does have policies that are very much aimed at containing China's rise right now, especially in the technology area, they have nothing to do with China's failed rebalancing. That's China's problem of its own making, just like America's savings problem is also of its own making. The final part of the book, which is really what I want to focus on here in the remaining time I have, is one that puts the false narratives together on both sides of the conflict to describe why the conflict is deteriorating so rapidly, and then to give you a sense of what I think needs to be done to address and hopefully resolve this conflict. If you put the false narratives of the US and China together and look at them as a system of narratives that must be considered holistically together when you look at the relationship. I do this from the standpoint of economic models, the role of state control, the critical importance that innovation plays in shaping the false narratives, the exercise of power, and the distortions of the truth that describe both nations' approach in thinking about false narratives. And this latter point is important because China, of course, has a state-sponsored censorship regime, which edits the truth in virtually all aspects of its behavior. But the US is not immune from distorting the truth, as the big lie of the 2020 presidential election illustrates. We have more than half of one of our two major political parties who still believes in this big lie, which is an information distortion that is every bit as serious is that which is evident through state-sponsored censorship in China. The combination of these false narratives, the Chinese side and the American side, I liken that to the high octane fuel of accidental conflict. And when you have high octane fuel, it is quite flammable and could very easily spark a much more serious conflagration. And there are plenty of potential sparks to think about. The incident that we just went through in the last few days over the Chinese balloon flying over the continental United States, especially over our strategic missile sites in Montana just a few days ago, are a classic example of what this trajectory of accidental conflict can create. We don't know why it occurred. I think it was a huge mistake by the leader for life, Xi Jinping, but it's a mistake with consequences, as we saw from the cancellation of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's long scheduled visit to Beijing and aimed at cooling off the relationship. The relationship is not cooled off in any way whatsoever, and the failure of that mission to occur is very disturbing. There are plenty of other potential sparks to think about. Taiwan, especially with the likely visit of the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, looming in the not so distant future, tensions in the South China Sea, tensions arising from the war in Ukraine, especially in light of China's unlimited partnership with the Russian Federation, and the global recession risks, which I believe need to be taken seriously. Any one of these sparks, given the deteriorating relationship and the escalation of conflict that has occurred between the United States and China over the last 5 years, is worrisome. Any one of them is worrisome, and the combination of several of them, and ones that I haven't even listed here that we don't know about, add to my concerns. So what's the way out? On the right, I give you some things to think about, and then I'll give you 3 specific recommendations. In resolving this conflict, first and foremost, we need to restore a climate of trust between two nations where there is no trust whatsoever today. Secondly, we need to set up guardrails that warn us when the relationship is in trouble. Thirdly, we need to move away from zero-sum confrontation where one nation asks too much of the other in exchange for forcing a compromise on a key issue from the partner. And thirdly, we need to take a careful look at the architecture of engagement, how these two nations communicate and work together rather than at odds with one another. So trust must come first. And it's very difficult to restore trust in a relationship where there is none right now. So I have a list here on the left of some easy things that can be done. Consulates that have been closed by both nations should be reopened. Visa restrictions should be relaxed. And educational foreign exchange student educational exchanges should be restarted. Similarly, but tougher to do, relieving some of the constraints that are being placed on non-governmental organizations today that were not in place prior to the onset of the trade war in 2018. That's tougher to do, but not nearly as tough in dealing with three very important global issues that both nations, as well as the world, has an enormous stake in: climate change, global health, and cybersecurity. We've made virtually no progress in those three big issues. A little bit of discussion on climate, but no meaningful progress. And ultimately, we must address all of these issues as well. If we are able to establish some trust, then the second and third recommendations I have are feasible. The second one is to embrace and move ahead and renegotiate, complete negotiations on a bilateral investment treaty. Prior to the election of Donald Trump, we were 95% of the way to completing a bilateral investment treaty, which lowers market barriers, increases investment, cross-border investment for both nations in their respective markets, and is pro-growth, as opposed to the zero-sum trade deals like you see illustrated on the left, the so-called Phase 1 trade accord, which accomplished nothing. The goal was to boost Chinese purchases of U.S. products by 200 billion over 2020 and 2021, as shown by the dotted red line in the graph. By the end of 2021, the dashed blue line shows that China fell $200 billion short of the $200 billion deal. It was a complete, utter failure. And to the point that I noted earlier, you can't fix a multilateral trade deficit with a bilateral deal. This framework was a failure from the start, and my preference again is for a bilateral investment treaty. And the third proposal I have is one that addresses this issue that I noted at the outset, the new architecture for engagement, and I lay this out in the form of a detailed proposal in my new book for a U.S.-China Secretariat. It sets up a permanent organization located in a neutral country, call it, for the sake of discussion, Switzerland, equally staffed by American and Chinese professionals who are charged with working full-time on all aspects of the relationship, from economics and trade to technology transfer, innovation policy, subsidies of state-sponsored activities, and the big mega issues like climate change, global health, cyber, and even human rights. And the Secretariat, unlike earlier efforts that would spontaneously be assembled to support strategic and economic dialogues that occurred once or twice a year in recent years, this is a full-time 24/7 organization that is charged with developing collaboratively authored policy white papers off a common database. The Secretary would have the capacity to convene experts to deal with troubles and problems that would invariably arise, such as COVID. If we'd had the Secretariat convene a panel of experts in the outbreak of COVID, both the United States and China would have benefited immensely. And the Secretariat is also charged with the oversight and compliance of new and existing agreements between the nations, and should disputes arise, there would be a dispute resolution mechanism embedded in the Secretariat. So that's my plan. It's not perfect, and I certainly welcome any thoughts you may have on creating a better plan. So my conclusion is that the U.S.-China conflict is headed toward an accident that does not have to happen. But these accidents have enormous consequences, whether they occur by mistake or on purpose. The consequences can result in enormous risks of strategic instability. We're already in the early stages of a new Cold War, and we should worry about the history of a conflict between rising and ruling powers that have led to hot wars all too often in the past, the so-called Thucydides trap. The conflict has enormous implications for economic instability, affecting the economic outlook for China and the United States. China right now is widely expected to enjoy a strong rebound after abandoning its impractical zero COVID policy. But I'm more worried about what comes after the rebound, and I'm much more negative on China's growth prospects over the long term than I have ever been, and we can address that in the Q&A session. Of course, in the U.S., there is enormous debate on the possibility of whether or not the U.S. Will experience a soft landing after an extraordinarily large monetary tightening, which is yet to run its full course. And finally, what about the global economy? Are we moving into a period of higher inflation? And how do central banks respond to that in a way that does not lead to new sources of instability in global asset markets? So, Dr. June, that's my overview. I welcome the comments and questions from you and the esteemed discussants that you have brought together today.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your brilliant opening presentation. Also, I'm happy to let you know that given the importance and timeliness of your new book, there is a tremendous interest in your presentation speech today from our members and audience in general. I am told this morning that one of our esteemed member from Korea Deposit Insurance Corporation, and new president, Dr. Yu Jae-hoon, and his entire senior executives are getting together to watch this webinar this morning. That's something good about your presence here this morning. Now I would like to proceed with the discussion on some topical issues following your presentation, starting with three prominent discussants representing business and academia here in Korea. First, lady first, so allow me to invite an outstanding lady, Ms. Lee Chun-min, who is Chief Risk Officer at Standard Chartered Bank. Prior to joining Standard Chartered some 15 years ago, Ms. Lee had a long and excellent career in the international financial industry, including at Lehman Brothers, Nomura Securities, and HSBC. Ms. Lee, you're on. Welcome.
Thank you, Stephen, for sharing your insight. My question is, how do you think the Korean government and the Korean global corporate can best navigate the complex geopolitical landscape and changing global trade system? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Korea, of course, is caught in the crossfire with important reliance on the United States for security and important reliance on China as its largest trading partner. And Korea, of course, needs vigorous trade and support from Chinese external demand to satisfy its growth imperatives. But I think, and Korea is not alone, many other nations, especially in Eastern Asia, have that similar dilemma of how to address this conflict, having a stake on both sides. And I honestly believe that while that feels uncomfortable and a dilemma, it's also an opportunity for nations like Korea that are so important in many respects to both countries in conflict right now, to play a role in levering that importance and pushing for the type of resolution that I just presented today. The problem, as I attempted to identify it, is a relationship problem. Americans, we like to say that we have a China problem, and the Chinese say the same thing, but looking at it the other way as a US problem. And my approach is to say it's both of our problems. This is a relationship problem. And so I propose a relationship solution. And countries like Korea and other allies in Eastern Asia, if you stand collectively and express the view that this is a relationship problem in need of a relationship solution, and you may not agree with all of the proposals that I had, but if you stand together and demand that both nations address this problem collectively, I think you can play a very important role in taking this conflict away from the edge that it currently is on, and that's the best way I can address your important question.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? You're welcome to raise any other related questions, Ms. Lee.
Thank you. I'll
Go ahead.
pass on next the guest. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next, I would like to invite Dr. An Chung-young, who is a distinguished professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Chungang University and former chairman of the Korea Commission for Corporate Partnership, for his questions or comment. Professor An, welcome.
Good evening, Professor Roach. I'm really delighted to meet you online. It is always my great pleasure to recollect that you and I participated together China Development Reform organized by the China Development Research Center and held at the Taoyi Tai in 2003, 2004, and 2005. Well, by the way, congratulations on your seminal book publication. But unfortunately, I have not read yet your book, but I plan to order the book. I think this should be very good news for you. Well, it seems to me that the title of your book is perfectly fitting to the incident of the recent the Chinese balloon incursion. Well, I'm also very much impressed with the suggestion establishing of U.S.-China Secretariat. But here, I would like to present some questions in terms of the unavoidable conflict, maybe intended conflict, rather than the accidental the conflict. The first question of the so-called China dream envisioned by the President Xi Jinping in the global hegemonic competition with the United States. I think politically and psychologically, China appears to restore the glory of the hegemonic power prevailed during the Tang Dynasty, in which China was the largest economy with the most sophisticated technology and the product like silk. From many Chinese scholars whom I met, I cannot help believing their deep-seated Sinocentrism, regardless of their membership of the Chinese Communist Party. I think there is a strong view the time is on China's side in the competitive race with the United States toward the world hegemon. The question is that, how do you view on China's eventual hegemon? Under this view, the trust can ever be built? I mean, as you did elaborated for your suggestion. The second one, I think I really would like to share my view. Despite the unavoidable economic linkage with China, neighboring countries in East Asia are very uncomfortable by China's historical behavior, which used to treat neighboring countries as a tributary state, believing that China has the most prominent civilization in the world. The emperor of China was considered the only legitimate emperor of all lands under heaven. Perhaps China's unilateral assertiveness in trade practices has annoyed many Koreans, especially after deployment of terminal high-altitude area defense against North Korea's missile propagations, not mentioning the build-up of an artificial island in the South China Sea. Well, U.S. Constitution is really based on the inalienable human right, free democracy, and market principle, freedom of press, and plural political party system. Whereas, you have already mentioned China maintains a communist single-party system, which does not allow an open exposition of alternative policy platforms. So in this regard, I think your suggestion of establishing a permanent secretariat could be feasible on the truly trust-based the hypothesis. And maybe if I may suggest one, avenue to get through U.S.-China, the co-dependent and the participation in the mutually the beneficial international architecture could be. China already applied for the membership of CPTPP, and if U.S. joins CPTPP, then both U.S. and China can work out formidable international rule-based architecture within the agreed framework of CPTPP. So what is your view on the possibility of the U.S. join to TPP together with China? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor An, for your brilliant comments and questions. Stephen?
Yes, Professor An, you raised some very, very deep and important points, and I will do my best to try to respond in the short time that we have. First, just one commercial on the book. There will be a Korean translation of accidental conflict available later this year. But for those of you who are eager to read the book before the translators take their task, I would urge you, of course, to order it on Amazon, where it's available by Kindle instantly. The China Dream is something that is extremely important, and it's one that I address directly in the third chapter of the book. But like most of these concepts, I stress that China is not alone in expressing this aspirational nationalistic dream. And I, in my chapter 3, compare the China Dream directly with the American Dream, which has become a very important aspect of our culture and our own aspirational value system. I take your point that the China Dream is emblematic of something very different than the American Dream, especially as articulated by Xi Jinping within 2 weeks of his appointment as party secretary in November of 2012. He first spoke of the dream at the National Museum of China on Tiananmen Square after he had gone through an exhibit that I and many others have seen, an exhibit that showed the rejuvenation of a proud nation after a century of humiliation. And he expressed the view that, as you correctly put it, that China would never again be humiliated as it was in the 100 years following the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century, and that a Chinese rejuvenation to its former status would be a solemn pledge of Xi Jinping, and the Chinese people could hold him accountable for delivering on that pledge by the year 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. You're entirely right, of course, that a totalitarian one-party system is very different in attempting to deliver on such an aspirational nationalistic message than multi-party systems in liberal Western democracies like the United States. But nevertheless, I find the comparison between these two dreams very interesting and very important insofar as how they inform us about the two nations, their political systems, their goals, and their tendencies for conflict. Would CPTPP be a substitute for a secretariat? It could be. I think the CPTPP arrangement organization itself would need to be upgraded and brought into greater conformity with the types of ideas that I threw out to you in my secretariat. And there's no reason why the secretariat needs to sort of monopolize the debate. But the point of the secretariat, unlike multilateral organizations, which are very important, is it forces the United States and China into a framework of direct, real-time, permanent engagement with one another, rather than sort of getting lost in the weeds of a multilateral organization. So I think we need both, and I would be strongly in favor of both China and the US joining some type of multilateral trade organization, while at the same time deepening their bilateral ties through something like a secretariat. I'm afraid that doesn't do justice to your deep and thoughtful questions, but that, in the interest of time, that's the best I can do right now.
Thank you, Professor Han. Are you happy with the Stephen's response to you? Thank you for your valuable information this morning. Anything to follow up?
Professor Roach, I think at the moment the Korea, they pronounced Korea's version of the Indo-Pacific the framework. Korea declared that we shifted from structural ambiguity prevailed during Moon Jae-in administration. Now structural clarity in align with the United States in terms of the many the values the U.S. is pursuing. And although we have not decoupled China, or although Korea didn't mention anything, China to be excluded, but yet China is somewhat annoyed by the Korea's strategic clarity posture. So the question is that how we sort of navigate through this newly pronounced Korea's Indo-Pacific framework, try to maintain the Korea's trade relationship with China, but now here U.S. intervened to ban Korea's export of semiconductor, the equipment or high quality semiconductor to China. So that's our problem. What would be your advice on this Korea's dilemma?
The same as I indicated to the first speaker, that Korea and other East Asian economies that are caught in the crossfire have an opportunity to emphasize to both nations that neither party is right or wrong. The problem is a dysfunctional relationship that both need to repair. That may not sound like a satisfactory answer to your question, but for Korea to insist that the U.S. Withdraw its technology sanctions on China will get you nowhere with the U.S. And for Korea to embrace those sanctions will get you into trouble with your largest external market, China. So I think either one of those is a losing strategy. And again, I would urge you to focus more on the relationship between the nations rather than taking sides with any one of the nations in conflict.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Han, for your participation this morning. Thank you very much. Now, last but not least, I'm very happy to invite Mr. Philip Van Hoop. Philip is country manager at ING, the Dutch banking group, Korea. And also, he's also currently serving as chairperson for the Sustainability Committee at European Chamber of Commerce in Korea, ECC. Philip, you're on.
Thank you, Dr. Jan. Dr. Roach, very, very honored to meet you, and thank you for making it so late for us to spend the time with us. I had prepared a question about climate change, but I see you've addressed it already. So I think that already we both identified climate change as an area of possible cooperation. So if you allow me, maybe trying to deep dive it a little bit. Are there circumstances of the IRA Act, and particularly the significant investments, the significant turn taken by the US towards renewables, Would that be something that would make a little bit of alignment or a sort of easier cooperation between the US and China, given the historic investments of China in renewables and everything around that technology? So that was my first question. A second question, particularly within that framework, what about trying to work on common industry standards, or for you and I, since we're both bankers as well, standards for capital markets? So that would be my second question in that framework. And then the third one, of course, for us in Korea, what could be the role of Korea and what could be the benefit of that for Korea? So 3 sub-questions, if I may.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's terrific insight into a problem that must be solved, not just by China, not just by the United States, but for all of us in the world. President Biden made it very clear on his first day in office by rejoining the Paris Agreement on climate change, followed up by the extraordinary piece of legislation that he signed last year on the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that commits unprecedented U.S. federal funding to alternative energies. That America is solidly behind this. And this, as you correctly point out, is something that the United States and China share in trying to achieve their own national objectives for pollution control and environmental protection. It's such a natural area for the two nations to cooperate on that it's absolutely tragic that they have not been able to do that. And in just the last few days, we've started to hear rumors that in response to America's sanctions on advanced semiconductors, that the Chinese are thinking of the possibility of putting sanctions on exports of solar panels, which would directly impact the United States and other members of the U.S. alliance from having access to the most cost-efficient and technologically advanced source of alternative energy available in the world today. So the ability to be able to execute the policies of climate change through alternatives, if this turns out to be correct, is also caught up and ensnared in the same conflict that we have been talking about today. And that would be an enormous step backward for the world. I don't have a specific recommendation for Korea in solving the failure of the two nations to come together on climate. My recommendation there would be the same as what I provided to the other two interventions that have been made in this meeting today. And yet this is such an important problem for the world to address. Of the 3 big problems that I outline in the book, climate, health, and cyber, climate is the only area right now where we are having any mutual discussions, but they are tentative discussions at best, and we need to do more and really draw the two nations together into the broad multilateral framework of the Paris Agreement. And certainly Korea and other nations can play a role in putting pressure on both the United States and China to move down that road together rather than in conflict.
Philip, okay?
Yes,
Was
yes,
there
yes.
any follow-up?
Dr. John. No, very, very okay. If you allow me, Dr. John, and just one other question, totally different. Dr. Roach, you mentioned about the U.S.-China Secretariat, and you eloquently mentioned no need to point to a location, maybe Switzerland. So can I return the question to you and say, hey, what about Singapore?
I have nothing against Singapore. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. I would be perfectly content with locating the Secretariat in any neutral country around the world. I mentioned Switzerland only because it is everybody's favorite neutral venue. Singapore is Asian, and there might be some who would object to having a neutral organization located in Asia, but I would be perfectly fine with that.
Okay, thank you, Philip, for your interesting thought and suggestion. Appreciate your participation today. Now, we are receiving a record number of questions through our chatting room. Now, that says something about the popularity, if you like, of this webinar and your book as well. I have no time to go through all these questions, and actually some of them have been addressed through our Q&A so far. Perhaps I made just one quick question from the questions received through chatting room, and then before we close, I would have one question for you. Now, the question that I'm looking at here is that now the very tricky situation involving U.S.-China relationship. Now, do you anticipate any change in a good way or in a positive way if the election outcome, the presidential election in the United States in 2024, the outcome is the re-election of Mr. Biden?
Well, that's obviously a very topical
Hypothetical question.
And important. But I don't see any dramatic shift. And I have a chapter in the book that describes my disappointment in the policies of President Biden following the very belligerent policies of his predecessor, Donald Trump. On President Biden's first day in office, January 20th, 2021, he signed 14 executive orders that removed some of President Trump's most outrageous policies: the construction of the border wall in Mexico, the end of the Muslim travel ban. He rejoined the Paris Agreement on climate change. He rejoined the World Health Organization, but he did nothing to eliminate the tariffs on China. And in fact, in the last couple of years, his policies in many respects, especially in the technology area, have been tougher on China than they were in the Biden administration. And it's driven by politics. This is the one issue where Republicans and Democrats are united. A few weeks ago, the U.S. House of Representatives passed by an overwhelming bipartisan majority, by a vote of 365 to 65, establishing a new select committee to deal with China. And I worry that this will now become a platform for official China bashing in America. Biden is not going to resist that trend. His margin of support in the United States, Congress as well as the electorate, is too thin. So even if he is elected or reelected, I should say, I think he will stay the same course he's on. And I find that very worrisome for the conflict with China.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Stephen, for your response to that question. The last question for you is already it's time to close, but that is that you did mention toward the end of your presentation, very briefly, about Chinese economy. Now, of course, the reopening of China did send a very positive signal to the market, global economic prospect. IMF, for example, indeed raised their expected growth of the global economy by 0.2%, as I recall. Now, that's good news. But you did also mention, but very properly, that you're less optimistic about China's long-term growth prospect because of the structural issues. We all know that excessive debt problem, demographic changes in wrong direction, all those things. Now, could you quickly elaborate on why you're less optimistic about China than before, and then the short-term positive impact of the
Well, first of all, I have been an optimist on China for 25 years, probably the most optimistic
Sure.
Wall Street economist in the United States with respect to China. But I am no longer optimistic about the medium to longer term growth trajectory for two reasons. You mentioned one, demography. We all knew that the Chinese faced a demographic problem, but it's come sooner than we thought. The working age population has been declining since 2015, and now the overall population is declining, very much like Japan. But unlike Japan, China's getting older before it got rich,
Right.
and that's a big deal. The second concern is when economies face declines in their working age population, there's only one choice they have to offset that if they want to maintain rapid economic growth, and that is to boost the productivity of the workforce. Korea has been very good in boosting productivity of its workforce. That's where I am concerned now about China. Total factor productivity has been declining for 10 years, largely because Xi Jinping made the mistake of shifting support back to low productivity state-owned enterprises. But going forward, the productivity problem is going to get worse, not better, especially in light of Xi Jinping's regulatory pressures that he has put on his high productivity internet platform sector. The government recognizes that this has been a mistake. They've attempted to talk it down, but they have not, in my opinion, made significant changes to unwind the pressures on the demand side of internet activities in areas such as music, video streaming, and other activities, including private sector tutoring that support the internet economy. And finally, the conflict itself is, I think, very negative for productivity. In the 20th Party Congress of last October, Xi Jinping focused far more on conflict than on productivity and economic growth, and that will take resources away from the dynamism of the Chinese economy that is required to offset the headwinds from demographic pressures. And so that's why I'm now much more negative on the Chinese growth outlook than I have ever been in the 25 years that I have focused on China. And probably for that reason, Dr. An, I will not be invited back to the China Development Forum because they always invited me from the beginning. I've been there every year for over 20 years because I've been the optimist. And I think they only want the optimist to come to that important gathering.
Thank you, Stephen, very much for your closing remarks and your changing view about China's future economy as something very serious about the nature of the structural issues that China is facing. Now that I'm hoping that that message is shared and hopefully some changes in the course of managing their own political environment and economic policies down the road for themselves and for the world. Thank you very much, Stephen. I think we should plan on having you again, perhaps toward the end of the year when Korean translation of your book is published. We'll be in touch, and hopefully we'll see you again next time in person. Today, thank you very much for sharing your great insight with our members and audience.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.